My name is Rose McQueen. I'm the Secretary of the LGBT Society, and today I'm interviewing Barry Black, who's the Scottish Labour candidate for Aberdeen Central. Thank you, Barry.
Pleasure.
First off, what are Labour's goals for this new Holyrood term coming up?
So what I think is became very clear over the past year is a lot of, during the pandemic, a lot of the inequalities that we already saw in society beforehand have really been exacerbated and made worse. And what Labour is putting forward in this election is the need for the next 5 years to be wholly focused on recovery from the pandemic, for our national effort, our national collective effort to be focused on the areas where we've seen the inequalities increase and where inequalities existed already, really being tackled, with the sort of collective weight that we have. So in jobs and the economy, for example, we want to see a guaranteed job for every young Scot, expansion of apprenticeship schemes in Aberdeen, support for the energy sectors and the hospitality sectors as well. And the NHS, we need to get cancer treatment back on track, so we never again have to choose between treating a virus or treating cancer. And we've got a plan in place to really speed up catching up with cancer treatments and cancer screenings. In education, a comeback plan for every pupil focused on their social needs and mental health, a reset guarantee for those who have been let down by the alternative arrangements that have been in place, and a national tutoring scheme, a climate justice plan to really tackle on head on the grave threat that we face from climate change, and support for our communities, a community bounce back fund, and really just plans and resources to make our community stronger and safer. So those 5 areas are the ones that we're going to be focused on the next 5 years in this sort of effort of a united national recovery.
You mentioned the climate emergency. What would Labour do to tackle the climate emergency that we are facing?
So we need to see sort of quite radical action taken. And the first thing is that we really need to harness the opportunity of COP26, our hosting of COP26, to get a Glasgow agreement, to renew the sort of world's approach to getting global temperatures down and taking the action that were needed. The Paris Agreement was a great step, and we need to harness that energy coming into COP26. Crucially, I think we need to see a much more radical, quicker transition to sort of greener energies, greener technology, and hopefully Aberdeen in the northeast, much like we are with oil energy, being the sort of focus of where that jobs and where that skills and where that transition takes place. And I think a lot of the skills and expertise that already exist in Aberdeen can really help us accelerate that process. And we need to see a much quicker move to more sustainable forms of transport, more green energies within our public transport. And Aberdeen again has sort of led the way with the hydrogen buses that we've seen, and a much quicker move away from people using personal cars into more sort of either public transport or I'd say sustainable energies for using it. And really it needs to be a sort of economic shift in how we look at that and the sort of renewables. And alongside those things are that's kind of the macro issues, along some of the more micro issues that Labour are looking at to get into in the next 5 years, are about better energy efficiency in homes, better insulation, building new homes for social rent that are carbon negative, and all of these issues, and how we use our procurement and how we use our state funding for capital projects to actually be sustainable.
And do you think that Labour's plan to do that might have to have an uphill battle, seeing as Labour's lost seats in every election since 1999, starting on 56, now being down onto 24? What do you think the plan is there to get back? Do you see a way back into power?
Yeah, but it's not a quick one. It's one that's going to take time. Our new leader, Anna Sarwar, has been very honest about how we haven't been the Labour Party that people needed or people deserved, particularly in the last few years. And I would agree with that assessment. Labour wasn't even on the pitch, let alone actually in a viable position to get these plans that I'm talking about into action. So what I'm hoping to see next month, and even that this is a hard task, is advancement of Labour's position. As you say there, every election since 1999, Labour's lost ground, and it's time that we need to start winning that ground back. So a Labour government in Scotland is a long-term ambition, and we have to be very honest about that. But what's very clear from these past few years is that Scotland, yes, needs a better government, but by goodness, it needs a better opposition. And that has to be our plan, to put forward a progressive, forward-looking plan for Scotland, and invite people to vote for it. So I do see a future for Labour in Scotland, absolutely, and Labour empowering Scotland. But as I say, we're looking at a long-term project rather than a short-term game in that regard.
You mentioned Anna Starmer was recently elected as the new Scottish Labour Party leader. One of his first actions was to remove a candidate in Glasgow, Kelvin Holly Cameron, from the constituency because she was not against holding a second referendum. Do you think that people should be allowed to have that opinion within Labour instead of just saying that they don't want a referendum?
So I think on the particular case, I can't really comment on the particular case. I don't actually know the ins and outs other than what's been in the media. So it would be remiss of me to actually comment on that. I think, Labour is a broad church and always has been a broad church of views. And that's right. If you look at, even how, people's views on the economy, on areas of social justice, there are a broad church of views within the Labour Party, and there has to be space for those views to exist. But what I think we've been missing on a broader point, what we've been missing for years, in my opinion, with regards to the constitutional question, and it's one of the reasons we've lost ground at every election that you mentioned, and particularly recent ones, is a complete lack of clarity over the Constitution and where Labour stands on the Constitution. And, there will be people who disagree with the fact that we oppose a referendum. But what I think is that people respect the clarity that they're giving them. So the Constitution is the biggest question in people's minds in Scotland, and still is and has been. And if you can't give people a clear answer to the biggest question on their mind, they have every right to ignore everything else that you've got to say about all the other questions if you can't have a straightforward answer on the biggest issue. And I think that's really, one of the big positives of Anas coming to the leadership is that we have that clarity that's been missing for the past few years. And, I think what we need to see is a united Labour Party going into the election. So there has to be space for the broad church of views, but particularly when we get to the stage of people being candidates, we really need to be united and get behind a joint sort of vision and manifesto.
Do you think, sticking with the constitutional question for a bit, do you think that having, as yes has been top of the polling that has been done by various organisations for the past year or so, do you think it would be right to hold one within the next Parliament?
So I don't think it would be right to hold one in the next Parliament. I think our entire focus has to be on recovery from the pandemic. I think, as I talked about before, the sort of inequalities that existed before, the inequalities being exacerbated, the situation that our people, communities, and institutions find themselves in coming through the pandemic has to be the focus on sort of, building that back to normality and building it back to be better. So in the 5 areas I mentioned of jobs, health, education, communities, and climate, surely our whole collective effort needs to be on recovery in those areas. And we need to bring people and communities together rather than do what a binary referendum question does and drawing people apart. So I think a referendum in the next 5 years would be the wrong priorities for Scotland. And to be honest, and we'll find out in a few weeks when the election happens, but to be honest, I think even for some people who support independence, the idea of it happening, kind of immediately, isn't one that they want to see. The SNP are talking about the next 2 years, in the next 2 years to have a referendum. And I just think that's completely the wrong priorities, for the reasons of the unity and division, but also the key reason of where our effort and energy and resources and attention is going to be faced has to be on recovery rather than division.
And you mentioned education being one of the key parts of the vision for the next 5 years. You are credited as one of the people who saw the overturning of the SQA fiasco that was handled by the Scottish Government. Do you think John Swinney should have resigned over that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was lucky enough to be credited as one of the people who did some of the research, but I think that the young people who went out and and protested and got the U-turn, are the real ones that did that. And it's undoubtedly John Swinney should have lost his job over that fiasco. He shouldn't have even had the chance to resign. He should have been sacked for it, because what he oversaw was the ingrainment of inequality into the exam system. He took what was already a stubborn and vast attainment gap that he'd presided over in Scotland, and he built it into a statistical model. It's the most gross sort of inequality that you can imagine, particularly when you're talking about something as important to life chances as exam results. And we've seen it when Labour was in government in Scotland in previous years. We saw the SNP call for resignations when it's still a bad mistake, but thousands of people got sent the wrong exam certificate. And we saw, the SNP call for resignation of the education minister there. This was the biggest scandal in education in the history of devolution. And it's quite an indictment on our parliament and politics, really, that John Swinney managed to remain in place after that.
Do you think we're heading into a similar situation now with the new way of awarding the marks this time round without an exam?
So yeah, I do, because we've got a few problems with it. So one is that the government say there isn't an exam, and there isn't in the sense of everybody sitting National 5 Modern Studies will be in an exam hall at the same date and the same time. But there are exams going on at a school level and exam conditions that are being used to influence the grades. And what I think we're heading for this time is another fiasco, scandal, shambles. But what I think it will be more difficult to explain why it has been a shambles and unfair than it was last year. So last year it was fairly simple. It was fairly simple when you realised what they had done is they'd taken teacher estimated grades and moderated them based on the previous results of a school by proxy, marking people based on their postcode. Whereas this year it's kind of a school by school level. The marks and the moderation process are much more of a qualitative process, which can work. I think the SQA have left it too late. There's been far too little information. Schools, parents, teachers, pupils, aren't particularly clear on, the start and the end point and all the way through it. So I think we are heading for another scandal. Exactly how it will play out remains to be seen, but considering that they've had a sort of year to prepare to get to this stage, I think it's been handled very, very badly as well.
And something else that has been not handled particularly too well, Keir Starmer's recent visit to a church who promote conversion therapy. It took him the entirety of the Easter weekend to apologise for that mistake. And that included a member of his shadow cabinet going and defending it, claiming he wasn't visiting it because it was a church, despite it being part of his Good Friday messaging. And closer to home, we see MSPs, Labour MSPs, being able to just leave their jobs, despite being accused of transphobia, rather than being handled by the Labour Party, who one of the founding ethos is of solidarity and equality. Do you think Labour has an issue with the LGBT plus community?
So, I mean, on the particular issues that you mentioned, I think I would agree with you with the around Keir Starmer's visit and things like that. It shouldn't have happened in the first place because the due diligence should have been done, and then when it was pointed out, around the issues, the retraction and the apology should have came much quicker. I think, and this isn't a cop-out, I don't think Labour does have a problem with the LGBT community as an institution, as a party. I think political parties broadly, will represent the broader society that exists within them. So every party is going to have problems with, bigots, extremists, however kind of you may wish to define that. But there's clear within all political parties, and Labour is no different, there has been an uptick and an issue with transphobia. And I think there's got to be the sort of action taken that we've seen with regards to anti-Semitism in recent years in Labour, who didn't take that seriously and moved to a position now where it is being taken more seriously. The Tory party had issue with sort of Islamophobia as well, and the same action needs to be taken for that prejudice, with the prejudice against any sort of minority community treated in the same way with the same seriousness, in my opinion. Part of the problem is, I think we've seen in Scotland, is we've had a proposal for JRA reform that, hopefully and broadly would have dealt, at a broader level with the kind of issues that you bring up there. That has the can's been kicked down the road with it, so it's been continuously delayed rather than legislation presented to Parliament to actually have this reform take place. And what I think has happened in the inception of the fact that Scotland was going to have legislation on JRA reform and it being kicked down the road with consistent and constant sort of consultations, is that we've seen a situation where, rather than a debate or discussion based on facts and legislation and what actual changes are going to mean, we see a situation where just bile and scare stories or whatever can sort of just permeate around the sort of discourse, to this point where we're in a really toxic place of entrenchment and a real division within the debate, if that makes sense. So what I think we need to see very quickly in the new Parliament, and it should have happened this Parliament, is GRA reform, which hopefully at a broader level would then deal with all of these issues rather than this kind of happening at an amendment by amendment, bill by bill basis, if that makes sense. So the issues, what has been promised and proposed can be debated and scrutinised in Parliament. There may be concerns that people have, but then probably be genuine concerns based on the letter of a bill rather than wider context in the media, whatever it may be. And then all of those issues can be dealt with at that level, if that makes sense. And you're not at the stage where it's amendment by amendment, bill by bill. And that would be one of my hopes for early on in the next Parliament, because I think when was it, 2017 or 18, the programme for government, the SNP announced there was going to be a bill on a gender recognition act, and I think we've had 2 or 3 consultations now, and the bill has never came to force. And whether people are for or against, or we need to have this discussion and debate around actual changes, actual legislation, actual proposals, rather than the sort of wider toxic debate that we see at the moment.